History remembers Messalina as Rome's most depraved empress, a nymphomaniac who competed with prostitutes for fun. But that's the story her enemies wanted you to believe. The truth is far more complex and strategic. In this video, we will unveil Messalina's 10 alleged sexual pleasures, and we'll show you how each scandal might not be a simple act of lust, but a calculated move in the most dangerous game of all: power in ancient Rome. Did you think you knew history's greatest scandals? Stick around, because you're about to discover that the rumors barely scratch the surface of a conspiracy that shook the very foundations of the empire. Imagine Rome in the middle of the 1st century. A colossal empire, a city of marble and gold, but also of blood and secrets. At the center of it all, in the imperial palace, sits Emperor Claudius. A scholarly man, but seen by many as a puppet, an unexpected survivor in the lethal Julio-Claudian family, where life expectancy was short if you had too much ambition. And beside him, his 3rd wife, a woman whose beauty was as legendary as her infamy, Valeria Messalina. Born into the highest Roman aristocracy, related to Augustus himself, Messalina seemed destined to be an exemplary matron. But fate, and perhaps her own nature, had other plans. Married to a man 30 years her senior, an emperor who came to the throne almost by accident, Messalina found herself, at just 20 years old, at the pinnacle of world power. She had access to incredible wealth, influence over the most powerful man on the planet. And most importantly, she realized that in the Roman court, an empress's body was not just for bearing heirs, it was a weapon. Today, we are not telling the story from the textbooks. We will explore the darkest corners of her biography, the 10 pleasures and scandals that forged her dark legend. But with a key warning: every one of these accounts was written by men. Men like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, who wrote decades after her death, with clear political agendas and a deep suspicion of powerful women. Our mission will be to try to separate fact from fiction, lust from strategy, and discover the truth about the woman Rome loved to hate. Because Messalina's pleasures, as we will see, were not simple whims. They were bold moves in a deadly game for survival and control of the Roman Empire. Let's start with one of the most potent and scandalous images of Messalina's legend. Picture the scene. Night falls over Rome. While Emperor Claudius sleeps, his wife, the most powerful woman in the empire, slips out of the palace. She covers her hair with a cheap blonde wig, the distinctive color of prostitutes, and heads to the slums, to the infamous Subura district. This isn't a stroll. It's a transformation. The empress disappears, and Lysiska, meaning wolf woman in Greek, is born. According to the poet Juvenal, under this alias, Messalina would enter the seediest brothels. There, in a reserved room, she would undress, displaying her supposedly gilded nipples, and receive client after client, competing with professional prostitutes. Juvenal's description is almost cinematic. He claims Messalina was always the last to leave, returning to the palace at dawn, exhausted and dirty from the lamp smoke, but still unsatisfied. This image of the empress prostitute is the cornerstone of her infamous reputation. But let's be critical. Is it really believable that the most famous woman in Rome could operate incognito without being discovered? It's highly unlikely. Sources like Juvenal were satirists. Their goal was not journalism, but exaggerated moral criticism. For a poet who despised the elite's decadence and the power of women, what better symbol than an empress who lowers herself to the dregs of society? Now let's consider a strategic interpretation. Although the story of Lysiska is almost certainly a fabrication, it could have a speculative root of truth. What if Messalina wasn't seeking pleasure but intelligence? In a world without social media, brothels and taverns were hubs of information. She could have used a network of spies to gather secrets and rumors from the common people and soldiers. In this sense, her supposed nightly escapades would not be a sign of depravity, but of formidable political cunning, a form of espionage that gave her a crucial advantage. Messalina's power, according to the chroniclers, manifested not only in forbidden pleasures, but in the brutal elimination of her rivals, both political and romantic. Messalina's purges had a personal, often sexual touch. A notorious case was that of Gaius Appius Junius Silenus. Apparently, Silenus was Messalina's platonic teenage crush, and despite her bringing him back from exile and having him marry her own mother to keep him close, he rejected her. An intolerable affront. According to the historian Cassius Dio, Messalina and her ally, the freedman Narcissus, devised a plan. One morning, they ran terrified to Claudius, claiming to have had the same dream, that Silenus was going to murder him. When Silenus, who had been previously summoned, arrived at the palace, the superstitious Claudius saw the prophecy fulfilled. Silenus was executed for treason without a trial. Another episode reveals her alleged cruelty. Messalina desired two things: the famous actor Nestor and the luxurious gardens of Lucullus, owned by the senator Valerius Asiaticus. The problem: Nestor was in love with her rival, Poppaea Sabina the Elder, and Asiaticus didn't want to sell his gardens. The solution was lethal. Messalina accused them both of adultery and conspiracy. Under the pressure of a rigged trial, they were forced to commit suicide. In a single stroke, Messalina eliminated her rival and seized the coveted gardens. However, we must be cautious. Historians like Tacitus presented her as a femme fatale, driven only by lust and greed, an effective way to delegitimize her politically. By reducing her actions to the whims of a jealous woman, they denied she could have rational political motives. Valerius Asiaticus didn't just have nice gardens, he was a rich and influential man. His elimination could have been a strategic move to consolidate her faction's power in the court. From this perspective, each sexual revenge was also a political act. Eliminating Silenus sent a message to the aristocracy. Loyalty to Messalina was absolute. Acquiring the gardens of Lucullus was a transfer of wealth and prestige from a senator to the imperial house. Messalina used accusations of immorality, the very weapon that would be used against her, to destroy her opponents. Intrigue was her sharpest weapon. For the Roman elite, the most scandalous thing was not the number of her alleged lovers, but her complete disdain for social hierarchies. A discreet affair with a senator was one thing. Sharing her bed with inferior men, actors, gladiators, or soldiers was quite another. The ancient sources are filled with these accusations. The case of the actor Nestor is telling. It is said that Messalina was so obsessed with him that when he refused her, she went directly to Claudius and asked him to order Nestor to obey her in everything. Claudius, believing it was an artistic whim, agreed. Thus, the most famous actor in Rome was forced by decree to be her lover. This breaking of class barriers was a direct offense to the Roman social order. By giving herself to men of lower status, Messalina not only tainted her own dignity, but symbolically that of the emperor and the empire. But why choose lovers from lower classes? Let's look at the logic of power. First, for security. A betrayed senator was a dangerous enemy. A gladiator or an actor, on the other hand, were disposable pawns. Their silence could be bought, and their testimony discredited. They were safer pleasures. There's an even more strategic reading. By associating with figures popular among the masses, Messalina might have been building an unconventional power base. Furthermore, her alleged relationships with soldiers and centurions wouldn't be just for pleasure, but a way to cultivate loyalty within the army, the institution that ultimately decided who sat on the throne. Each encounter could be a transaction, information for favors, loyalty for protection. She was diversifying her sources of power, ensuring her influence didn't solely depend on her fragile relationship with the emperor. Beyond specific acts, what defined Messalina in the minds of her contemporaries was her defiant contempt for traditional Roman morality, the mos maiorum. Her conduct was not just immoral, it was seen as anti-Roman. An ideal matron was expected to be chaste, loyal, and dedicated to her home. Messalina was her antithesis. The accounts paint her not just committing adultery, but celebrating it, turning it into a public spectacle. The poet Juvenal, in his famous Satire 6, used her as the ultimate example of female corruption, calling her the imperial prostitute. Her name, Messalina, became synonymous with a lascivious and dissolute woman, an archetype that has endured for 2 millennia. It was said that she was not only promiscuous, but that she encouraged it, urging other senators' wives to follow her example. It is crucial to analyze this image critically. Historians like Tacitus belonged to the senatorial class, which viewed the growing power of women in the court with suspicion. Messalina's behavior, real or exaggerated, gave them the perfect ammunition to argue that female power led to chaos. By painting her as a moral aberration, they disqualified her politically. It was pure propaganda. But what if her contempt for morality wasn't a weakness, but a declaration of power? By breaking the rules so flagrantly, Messalina was declaring she was above them. It was a demonstration of power in its rawest form. Every lover, every party was not just a quest for pleasure, but an assertion of her exceptional status. In a world where she could not vote or lead armies, her body was her sovereign domain, and she used it to wage a cultural war against the norms that sought to confine her. Entering the more speculative territory of her legend, we find accounts suggesting her pleasures explored pain and domination. The historian Suetonius hints that Messalina liked rough sex, a phrase that has fueled all sorts of theories about domination games and whippings to achieve arousal. In this dark theater of pleasure, she would not only be the lustful empress, but also one who sought sensations at the limits of pain. This facet of her legend is undoubtedly the hardest to corroborate. The original sources are vague, and much of this comes from the literature and cinema of later centuries fascinated with the idea of the Roman femme fatale. It is very likely that these stories are fictional embellishments, projections of modern fantasies onto an already sensationalized past. However, even if it is fiction, we can analyze it symbolically. The concept of domination was central to the Romans. By playing with the roles of domination and submission in sex, Messalina would once again be subverting the order. If she enjoyed being dominated, it could be interpreted as a way to escape the burden of being an empress, ceding control in the only realm where she could do so without losing real power. If, on the other hand, she was the one dominating, the interpretation is even more potent. In public life, her power was indirect. In the bedroom, she could exert absolute and direct power over another's body. It was a complete reversal of gender roles. The woman, traditionally passive, became the active agent controlling pleasure and pain. Whether real or imaginary, these supposed pleasures reinforce the idea of a woman who experimented with power in all its forms. The stories of masochism and domination turned her into a threat to the natural order, blurring the lines between male and female power. If escapades to the brothels were her clandestine side, the parties in the palace were the public manifestation of her power. The chroniclers described the Palatine Hill transformed into a stage for bacchanals that would have scandalized her predecessors. These were not simple dinner parties. It is said that Messalina instigated promiscuity among her guests. The wives of senators, who in public were supposed to be paragons of virtue, were allegedly encouraged to participate in these festivities. The palace became a space of transgression, controlled by her. Imagine the power this gave her. A senator saw his wife with another man, and the next day, he was a compromised man. Messalina knew his secret, his humiliation. She held a perfect blackmail weapon. These parties weren't just for fun, they were a secret gathering machine. Again, the scale of these events is likely exaggerated. The word orgy is a very loaded label, often used to demonize enemies. It is probable that her parties were more luxurious and morally lax, but the idea of unbridled bacchanals is surely a hyperbole to paint a picture of absolute decadence. Strategically, these parties were an immense political tool. First, they were a test of loyalty. To be invited was a sign of being in her circle. Second, they were a blackmail factory. In a society obsessed with honor, knowledge of others' indiscretions was the most valuable currency. And third, and perhaps most importantly, these parties redefined power in Rome. Traditional power resided in male domains like the Senate. Messalina created a new center of power, her salon, her bedroom. It was soft power based on social influence and manipulation, but no less effective. The palace orgies, real or not, were not the goal. They were the means. The goal, as always, was power. By now, the theme is clear. For Messalina, sex and power were inextricably linked. This point is not a scandal, but the thesis that unifies everything else. Messalina was not simply a woman with a great sexual appetite. She was a strategist who understood that in the court, intimacy was the shortest path to political influence. Claudius was described as an intelligent man, but easily manipulated by his wives. Messalina exploited this weakness. She used her influence in the marital bed to promote her allies and eliminate her rivals. A whisper at the right moment, and a senator's career could end. But her use of sex went much further. She created a network of sexual espionage. Each lover was a source of information and a lever of influence. Through them, it is said, she placed her men in key positions, sold public offices, and amassed an enormous personal fortune. The ancient historians present this as a symptom of her greed and corruption. They describe her selling imperial favor from the bedroom, prostituting not only her body but the authority of Rome. In their narrative, she is the cancer that corrupts the body politic. However, from a modern perspective, this interpretation can be challenged. Messalina operated in a system designed by and for men. She had no access to the formal avenues of power. The only capital she possessed by right was her body and her sexuality. Can we blame her for using the only tool the system had left her? Her behavior, seen this way, is not corruption, but a pragmatic adaptation to a hostile environment. Men used war and money to gain power. She used sex. Her crimes, selling offices, influencing appointments, were no different from what many men of her time did. The only difference was the method. Her great sin in the eyes of history was not being corrupt, but being a woman who found a way to be as powerful as any man. We now come to the most famous and extravagant story of all, the anecdote that encapsulates her legend of excess, her legendary contest with a professional prostitute. The story, told by Pliny the Elder, says that Messalina, proud of her stamina, issued a public challenge to see who could service more men in a single night. The champion of prostitutes, a Sicilian named Sylla, accepted the challenge. The stage for this epic sexual battle was, supposedly, the palace itself. The night wore on, and men paraded through. At one point, after 25 men, the professional, Sylla, gave up, exhausted. But Messalina, according to the tale, continued, supposedly reaching the incredible figure of 200 men. When she finished, it is said she was still unsatisfied. Analytically, this story is almost certainly a fiction. The number is physically impossible, an exaggeration that reveals its mythical nature. It is a moral fable, a hyperbole designed to illustrate the depravity of the imperial house. The purpose was to show that the empress was not just as lascivious as a prostitute, but that she was capable of surpassing her, turning her into a kind of sexual monster. But even in the wildest fiction, we can look for meaning. What does this story represent? Ultimate competition. Messalina not only wanted to be the most powerful, but also the most desired, the champion in every field. The contest with Scylla, symbolically, is the struggle for total domination. Furthermore, the story can be a metaphor for her political ambition. Her appetite, described as sexual, was actually an appetite for power. An appetite so voracious that, according to her enemies, it led her to compete in arenas where no empress should have ever set foot. The legend of the contest is not about sex. It is about an ambition so boundless that it broke all barriers. All of Messalina's scandals pale in comparison to the act that sealed her fate. It was a move so bold and reckless that historians still debate her motives. In the year 48 AD, while her husband, Emperor Claudius, was alive and reigning, Messalina married another man. Her chosen one was Gaius Silius, described as the most handsome young man of the nobility. Taking advantage of Claudius's trip to Ostia, Messalina and Silius held a public and formal wedding in Rome, complete with a contract and witnesses. They organized a lavish banquet where, according to Tacitus, Messalina danced wildly alongside her new husband. This was much more than adultery. It was an act of bigamy and a seismic political statement. It was interpreted as the first step of a coup d'état to assassinate Claudius and place Silius on the throne, with Messalina as the power behind him. Was it really a coup attempt? Some modern historians doubt it, arguing it was too public and clumsy. Why risk everything? One speculative theory suggests it was a desperate ritual, perhaps to transfer a prophecy of death from Claudius to Silius. Another possibility is that Messalina felt her position weakening and sought to forge a new alliance to ensure her survival. Whatever the reason, it was a fatal mistake. The freedman Narcissus, a loyal advisor to Claudius and an enemy of Messalina, saw his opportunity. He rushed to Ostia and revealed everything to the emperor. Narcissus took control, convinced Claudius of the imminent danger, and mobilized the Praetorian Guard. Messalina's dream of power collapsed. Silius and his accomplices were arrested and executed. Messalina took refuge in the gardens of Lucullus, hoping to use her charms to obtain Claudius's forgiveness. But Narcissus made sure that meeting never happened. Fearing the emperor would waver, he sent a centurion with the order to execute her. They found her with her mother, who advised her to die with dignity. Messalina tried to take her own life, but her hand trembled. The centurion carried out his duty. Thus, at about 23 years old, the most feared woman in Rome died, a victim of the same web of intrigue she had woven. Messalina's death was the beginning of her legend. After her execution, the Senate, at Claudius's behest, decreed a damnatio memoriae against her, a condemnation of memory. This was no ordinary punishment. It was an attempt to erase a person from history. Her name was chiseled off all inscriptions and monuments. Her statues were torn down, destroyed, or altered to resemble other women of the imperial family. The goal was for future generations never to know that Valeria Messalina had existed. Paradoxically, this attempt to erase her is what made her immortal. The damnatio memoriae failed. Instead of silence, it provoked a flood of stories. The historians who came later, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, were under no obligation to respect the condemnation and filled the void with the most scandalous narratives, serving later regimes interested in painting the Julio-Claudian dynasty as a nest of monsters. Thus, the dark legend of Messalina was born. She became the canvas upon which they projected all Roman fears about female power, corruption, and moral decay. the historical woman was buried under the myth of the insatiable nymphomaniac. The final analysis forces us to recognize that the Messalina we know is, to a large extent, a literary and political construction, the product of one of the most successful posthumous smear campaigns in history. Her enemies not only killed her, they assassinated her reputation to serve their own ends, turning her into a warning for any woman who dared to accumulate power. And yet, through the propaganda, we can glimpse a fascinating figure. A woman who for 7 years navigated the deadly currents of the court with astonishing skill. She used the only weapons available to her, and for a time, she won. Her downfall was not due to lust, but to a political miscalculation. Her true legacy is not the scandal, but the demonstration of how powerful a woman could be in Rome, and the fear that power generated in the men who wrote her history. The fall of Messalina is a story of power, sex, and betrayal. Humiliated, Claudius ordered her memory erased and vowed never to marry again, a promise he broke by marrying his niece, the even more lethal Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero. She would ensure that Messalina's children, Britannicus and Octavia, would never be a threat, sealing the tragic fate of her lineage. 2,000 years later, the name Messalina is still synonymous with scandal. But as we have seen, the truth is more complex. An out-of-control nymphomaniac or a brilliant strategist? A victim of propaganda or the architect of her own destruction? The answer, most likely, lies somewhere in between. Now we want to know your opinion. Do you think power corrupts, or does it reveal who a person truly is? Was Messalina a villain, a victim, or a tragic anti-heroine? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you've been fascinated by this journey into the secrets of the Roman Empire, hit like and subscribe. We have many more controversial stories we're eager to tell you. Click on one of the videos on screen to continue exploring history like you've never been told it before. Thanks for joining us.